At 8 in the morning, before the gates even opened, before a single ball had been hit, there was already a line forming outside the US Open grounds. Not for Sabalenka. Not for Djokovic. For a 21-year-old from the Philippines who was not even playing that day. Let that sink in for a second. Nobody was watching yet. Nothing was on the line yet. And still, people showed up 2 hours early just to stand near a court where she might practice. So here is the real question. What is actually happening around Alex Eala right now? Because this is not normal fan behavior anymore. This is something bigger, something tournaments are not built to handle, and something the biggest names in tennis have started talking about out loud. By the end of this video, you are going to understand 3 things most people watching her matches have no idea about. You are going to understand why fans lined up before sunrise just for a practice court. You are going to understand what happened to her merchandise before she even played a single match in New York. And you are going to understand why players like Coco Gauff and Jessica Pegula, the exact players she is supposed to be competing against, keep publicly talking about the effect she has on a crowd. If you are Filipino, you already feel this in your chest. You have seen the flags. You have heard the chants. You already know something special is happening. But what you are about to see is bigger than pride. This is a phenomenon that is starting to reshape how Grand Slam tournaments plan their schedules, their courts, and even their security. And it all starts with one simple, almost unbelievable fact. Before Alex Eala had played a single point at this year's US Open, tournament staff were already treating her like one of the biggest draws in the entire event. That is where this story begins. If you are not a tennis person, here is everything you need to know in under a minute. Alex Eala just won her first WTA singles title in Washington. She climbed into the top 20 in the world for the first time in her career. And along the way she beat a former Wimbledon champion on the way to the 4th round at Wimbledon this year. That is not a rookie having a lucky run. That is a player who is actually breaking through. But none of that fully explains what is happening to her fanbase. Because if this was only about winning matches, this story would look like every other rising player in tennis. Win some matches, gain some fans, move on to the next tournament. That is the normal pattern. That is not what is happening here. This started in Manila, sure. But it did not stay there. It followed her to Melbourne, it followed her to Dubai, it followed her to Rome, it followed her to London. By the time she reached Washington and Toronto this summer, tournament staff in cities that had never heard her name a year earlier were already bracing for what was coming. Think about that for a second. A player ranked outside the top 15 in the world is generating crowd behavior that most Grand Slam champions do not get. And it is happening across multiple continents, in cities with zero connection to the Philippines, over and over again. If you grew up watching Manny Pacquiao stop an entire country in its tracks every time he stepped into a ring, you already understand the emotional gravity we are talking about. One person, carrying the hopes of millions, turning a sporting event into something closer to a national holiday. But Pacquiao had that effect inside one country. What is happening with Eala is starting to look like that same gravity, except it is showing up in a dozen different countries, at a dozen different tournaments, all in the same 12 months. That is the part that should stop you. Not that Filipino fans support her. Of course they do. That is not a mystery. The mystery is why this keeps happening in places where almost nobody in the crowd has ever set foot in the Philippines. So before we get into the 2 moments that actually prove how far this has gone, I want you to sit with that question for a second. Because once you see what happened in Cincinnati, and what happened to her merchandise before New York even started, you are going to understand why some of the biggest names in the sport are no longer staying quiet about it. If stories like this, the ones hiding just underneath the scoreline, are the reason you keep coming back to this channel, you already know there is more waiting for you here every single week. So stick around. Because what happened next in Cincinnati is the kind of detail that even hardcore tennis fans have not heard yet. And it starts with a tournament director who could not believe what he was looking at before the gates had even opened. Let us go back to Cincinnati for a second, because this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The tournament director there, a man named Bob Moran, has run professional tennis events for years. He has seen big crowds. He has seen star power. But even he could not explain what he watched happen before Eala's very first match of the tournament. She was scheduled on court 3. That is not the main stadium. That is a grounds court, the kind of match you can walk up to with a basic entry ticket, no special seating required. On paper, it should have been a quiet morning match with a modest crowd. Instead, by 8 in the morning, 2 full hours before the gates opened, there was already a line formed at the entrance. Not for the stadium court. Not for a marquee matchup. For a grounds ticket, to stand and watch a match on court 3. Sit with that for a second. This is not what happens for a player ranked outside the top 15 in the world. This is what happens for a defending champion on finals day. And it happened on a random morning, for a match most fans would not even bother checking the schedule for. So here is the first question worth asking. Is this just Filipino pride, showing up loud and proud the way it always does? Or is something bigger starting to take shape? Because here is what makes this hard to explain away as simple patriotism. This did not happen once. It happened again. And again. Tournament after tournament this year, organizers found themselves quietly making the same decision. Move her match to a bigger court. Not because the schedule called for it. Not because of ranking protocol. Because they knew what would happen if they did not. Think about what that actually means operationally. Grand Slam and WTA tournaments plan their court assignments based on ranking, seeding, and match importance. There is a system. There are rules. And yet, again and again this year, that system had to bend around one 21-year-old who was not even seated at most of these events. That is not a fan story. That is a scheduling problem. And scheduling problems only exist when the numbers on paper stop matching what actually shows up at the gate. Now here is where it gets even stranger. This was not limited to match days. Just this month, before the tournament had even started, Eala arrived at Flushing Meadows to begin her practice sessions. Practice sessions. Not a match. Not a ranking point on the line. Just training. And still, she needed a security detail to walk her from the car to the practice courts. Not because of any danger. Because of the crowd. Fans surrounded her, phones out, chanting her name, following her every step. So many people that security had to physically form a barrier just so she could walk in a straight line to hit some practice balls. Ask yourself honestly. When was the last time you heard about a player ranked 18th in the world, needing a security escort just to practice? This is the second mini question worth sitting with. If ticket lines were the only strange part of this story, you could chalk it up to enthusiasm. But security escorts for a practice session start to suggest something closer to the kind of attention usually reserved for a handful of superstars at the very top of the sport. And here is the uncomfortable truth building underneath all of this. None of these examples, not the Cincinnati line, not the court reassignments, not the security detail in New York, actually explain why this is happening. They are symptoms. They tell you the size of the phenomenon. They do not tell you the cause. Because if you strip away the flags and the chants for a moment and just look at the numbers, none of this should be happening. A player this far outside the top 10 should not be causing operational headaches for Grand Slam tournaments. And yet here we are, watching it happen over and over, in city after city, with no sign of it slowing down. So, if lines before sunrise and security escorts for practice sessions are already this intense, you have to wonder what happens when actual money enters the picture. Because it already has. And what happened to her merchandise before she had even played a single match in New York is the part almost nobody outside tennis circles has actually heard about. Here is the detail that most people scrolling through match highlights never actually see. Before Alex Eala played a single point at this year's US Open, her official tournament outfit had already sold out. Not after a win. Not after a viral clip. Before she even stepped on the court. Think about what that means. Nike does not guess when they set inventory for a major sponsored athlete. They plan based on data, past sales, projected demand. And still, the numbers were wrong. Demand outran every projection they had for her, days before the tournament even opened its gates. This is where the story stops being about ticket lines, and starts being about something much bigger. Because ticket lines are passion. Merchandise selling out before a ball is struck is money. It is brand value. It is proof that a company with far more data than any of us is watching this crowd and adjusting real financial decisions because of it. And this is exactly where the twist in this story shows up. For months, it was easy to explain all of this away as pure national pride. Filipino fans support their own. That part makes sense. That part is not surprising to anyone. But national pride does not explain why players who are not Filipino, players who are actually her rivals on the court, keep bringing her up in interviews without being asked. Coco Gauff, one of the biggest stars in the sport, said earlier this year that Eala is bringing an entirely new demographic into tennis, and that everyone on tour benefits from that. Think about who said that. Not a commentator. Not a journalist looking for a headline. A direct competitor, someone who has every reason to stay focused only on her own game, choosing instead to publicly point at another player and credit her with expanding the entire sport. Jessica Pegula did something similar after losing to Eala in the Washington final, joking about just how many fans showed up to cheer against her, on her own home soil, in her own country. And Mary Jo Fernandez, a former top-ranked player, and now a respected voice in tennis media, described the reaction around Eala, using a phrase that stuck with a lot of people. She called it next level. Here is the twist. This was never really a story about fandom. It became a story about what Eala represents. She is not just a player winning matches. She has turned into a signal, a data point, proof that tennis can pull in entirely new audiences it never had access to before. That is why Nike is recalculating inventory. That is why tournament directors are reassigning courts. That is why her rivals, the very players trying to beat her, keep talking about her instead of staying quiet. If you caught that shift, if you noticed the moment this stopped being a fan story and became an industry story, I want to know what you think it means for her long term. Because right now, comment sections under her matches are full of people from countries that have nothing to do with the Philippines, showing up just to say they are rooting for her too. If you are one of them, drop where you are watching from right now. I read every single one of these. And I want to see just how far this actually reaches. Because, here is what should make you pause. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened only once. It has repeated across different continents, different tournaments, different opponents, and different circumstances. A single viral moment can be explained away as luck. A pattern that repeats this consistently cannot. And there is one more piece of proof still ahead, the one moment that shows just how far this crowd effect actually reaches, even when she is playing against an American star, on American soil, in a match where every rule of home court advantage should have worked against her. That is where this story is headed next. Let us go back to Washington for a second, because this is the moment that removes any doubt. Eala was in the final. Her opponent was Jessica Pegula, an American player, on American soil, in a tournament where the crowd, by every normal expectation, should have been solidly behind the hometown favorite. That is not what happened. The crowd noise tilted toward Eala. Not evenly split. Tilted. In Pegula's own country, in front of what should have been a friendly audience, the energy in that stadium leaned toward a 21-year-old from Manila. Pegula herself joked about it afterward, openly acknowledging just how many fans had shown up specifically to cheer against her. Stop and think about how rare that actually is. This does not happen to a player ranked 18th in the world. This happens to defending champions. This happens to legends. This happens to the 2 or 3 biggest names in the entire sport. It does not happen to someone who was still fighting through qualifying rounds 2 years ago. Now put that next to everything else we have already seen. The line outside Cincinnati before sunrise. The security escort just for a practice session. Nike's inventory selling out before a single match was played. And now, a home country tilting its own crowd support toward a foreign player, in the final, on their own turf. Look across the current rankings, anywhere from 15 to 25 in the world. Not one other player at that level is generating this kind of crowd behavior. Not one. That is not an opinion. That is what tournament directors, sponsors, and rival players keep confirming every time this comes up. Which brings us back to the question we opened with. Why does this keep happening? Eala answered that question herself earlier this year, in a quote that barely made headlines but explains everything you have just watched. She said that if there was one thing she learned, it is that home is the people, and not the place. Read that again. Home is the people, not the place. That single sentence is the reason none of this feels like an accident. She is not simply accepting the support and moving on. She is actively building a relationship with these crowds, tournament after tournament, treating every stadium she walks into as an extension of the same community, no matter what country she happens to be standing in. That is why Filipino fans do not just show up once and disappear. That is why the same intensity followed her from Melbourne to Dubai to Rome to London to Washington and now to New York. She is not riding a wave of temporary attention. She is deliberately nurturing it. And now, as she walks into the 2026 US Open, every piece of this story is stacking on top of each other at the exact same moment. She enters as a projected seed for only the second time in her career. She is set to play mixed doubles alongside Felix Auger-Aliassime, with a path that could put her directly across the net from Novak Djokovic and Aryna Sabalenka. And she does all of this while carrying the single largest, most consistent crowd phenomenon tennis has seen from a player outside the top 10 in years. Every piece of proof we have walked through, the lines, the security, the sold-out merchandise, the rival players speaking up unprompted, it all points to the same conclusion. This was never just about one country supporting one athlete. This became a signal the entire sport is now paying attention to. And that signal is about to get its loudest test yet, on the biggest stage in tennis, in the next 2 weeks. So let us go back to that line outside the gates at 8 in the morning, before a single ball had been hit. At the time, it looked like a simple detail. A group of passionate fans, showing up early. Now you know what it actually was. It was the first visible sign of something that would go on to sell out merchandise before a match was played, pull security details for a routine practice session, and get her own rivals talking about her unprompted in press conferences that had nothing to do with her. That line was never really about a line. It was about what happens when a fan base stops behaving like fans and starts behaving like a market force. And here is what that means for what comes next. Alex Eala is walking into the 2026 US Open carrying more than a ranking, more than a seed, more than a single storyline. She is walking in as proof that a player does not need to be a top 5 name to reshape how a tournament plans its courts, its schedule, and its security. Nike already adjusted for it. Tournament directors already adjusted for it. Her own competitors already started talking about it in public. Which means the real question is no longer whether this is real. We just spent the last few minutes proving that it is. The real question is how far it goes from here. Does this stay a story about one remarkable fan base following one remarkable player, or does it become the blueprint other federations start studying when they try to figure out how to grow a sport in a country that has never had a tennis star before? Eala already told us how she sees it. Home is the people, not the place. If that is true, then this is not close to finished. Every new city she plays in becomes another home. Every new tournament becomes another test of just how far this can stretch. So here is what I want you to do. Watch what happens over these next 2 weeks in New York. Watch the crowd noise. Watch which court she gets assigned to. Watch what her rivals say afterward. Because if the pattern holds one more time, on the biggest stage tennis has to offer, you will be watching the exact moment this phenomenon stops being a story about the Philippines and becomes a story about the entire sport. I am going to be covering exactly that, match by match, as it happens. If you want to see how far this actually goes, and whether the pattern holds under the brightest lights tennis has, make sure you are subscribed, because the answer is coming faster than you think.